Hi guys, appropriately reporting to you live from my childhood home actually, which is kind of funny. My house, um, my son, little Graham, is at home with our babysitter Pat, and my dad is not here, and I am enjoying the peace and quiet. So I'm reporting live from my childhood living room. So I just wanted to give you a brief overview of the introductory chapter to adolescent development, and basically it's just an overview of where we're going. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this intro video. There's a couple take-home points that I want to make sure you understand, and then that should be about it. So, and I'm looking over here at my computer screen so I know what I want to tell you. So first we kind of go through the primary challenges. The big one that you really need to remember, if you frankly remember nothing much else from this class, is the fact that the crux of what the adolescent, him or herself, is trying to go through, the core problem or crisis, if you want to take Freudian and Ericksonian terminology, is identity. They're trying to figure out who they are at present and who they want to be. And that's quite a complicated process. So if you even sit back right now and think about how you became the wonderful human being that you are, it's hard to pinpoint perhaps one thing. It's a process. It's certainly a bit of a trial and error, and so some people have a really successful trial and error process, and for some people it's a little bit more bumpy of a road. Oh, see, that's what you get when you're at home. Pleasant. So those are some of the challenges, but we'll be talking about these in terms of chapters themselves: identity, autonomy, sexuality, and achievement in the schools. And just think for a second the ways in which adolescence has changed in the past 30 to 50 years. There's a lot of changes in the family, so we're going to talk about that period of time. There's a lot of challenges facing adolescents that are specific that a lot of parents and grandparents can't completely relate to, such as technology, things like cyberbullying. So there's some things that are unique. Technology in our world in general is moving really fast, and so this affects teenagers as they're developing. I'm not going to go through my pet peeves. There's a whole section here on the boundaries of adolescence. And so what I'm going to talk about here is there's many different boundaries. And the problem is, and why adolescence can be a little bit tumultuous, is because, one of the boundaries might be something like we're going to talk about sexual and biological maturation or pubertal development. That may happen really early. So say someone reaches, has menarche at the age of 11, but maybe cognitively, that kind of boundary of adolescence, they really haven't gotten to the point where they're completely reaching more of an abstract reasoning. They're more developed in their thinking. And so those two things interact in a way in which maybe you look more mature than you are cognitively. That can pose some problems. Sometimes it works out great, where maybe you become more emotionally and cognitively mature before you're biologically mature, and then things perhaps are more slated to go well. But there's lots of different changes happening in really quick succession, potentially, in a very intensified period of time. And so I think that's what the biggest problem is. So kind of having a sense of the different types of boundaries. In terms of chronological boundary, it's just really the second decade of life, which I think most people think adolescence starts around 13, and it actually starts around 10, so 10 to 20. And so you can kind of think to yourself, you may technically be an adolescent, but there's also a time period for you that we're going to talk about in a minute. So look through those different boundaries. There's the onset of puberty, and then the ending of the boundary would be when you're capable of sexual reproduction. That alone is a process. It may take years for that process to happen. There's emotional boundaries, there's legal boundaries, there are interpersonal boundaries, and so on. So and we'll talk about most of those in a separate chapter. So just kind of get a sense and a flavor of what the adolescent is going to. But I think the more important slide here in this chapter is really the fact that these transitions and these boundaries occur at different times. They interact one another in a different way, and they don't necessarily go in the perfect order every time. So there's lots of things happening. One thing that I think is really cool for you guys, that a lot of you actually fit into a developmental time period that's simply kind of related to adolescence chronologically. So it's called emerging adulthood. So it's a relatively new phenomenon, and this came out in kind of around 2000, 2004 as a way of saying, like, look, some people in your age group, this young adult age group, they're not completely adults, they're not completely adolescents. And so, and this came out of the fact that adolescence is generally being a little bit elongated because we need more schooling. We're not getting married as a culture as early as we used to. So you can think about the age at which your grandparents got married, or even some of your parents got married. That's probably earlier than what young adults are getting married at now in terms of age. So there's kind of this time period where you don't feel completely independent, but you are also not a teenager anymore. And so that's what Arnett would call emerging adulthood. And so it's actually associated with really good outcomes. It's kind of a privilege in some ways to be able to have that extended period of time to make different choices, to try different things out, to have a little bit of instability. And I do encourage you to listen to the Britney Spears song. I said Britney was really the first theorist that came up with this concept, so I think Arnett needs to perhaps give her some kudos, or at least some, rights to his theory. So a lot of what's happening is identity exploration that's been extended in some ways. So you're able to explore a little bit more career-wise, you're able to explore a little bit more relationship-wise. And again, I say this, and I hope your families are listening too, that I will say on camera, I hope you don't explore too much with romantic relationships. That exploration could lead to trouble. So for most people, it's kind of fun and exciting to have this instability, but at the same time, being in limbo can also be challenging. So some of this elongation of adolescence, this emerging adulthood, is typically associated with good outcomes, and again, making better choices with respect to careers, making better choices with respect to romantic partners. But sometimes some people don't tolerate that change, that instability, that, oh my gosh, in 6 months from now, I don't know where I'm going to be, what I'm going to be doing. So it just kind of depends. But at the end of the day, it's really the age of possibilities. There's a lot of things. You are not, pigeonholed into doing one thing, typically in the U.S. or in Western culture, so it's really a positive thing. Okay, so there's Arnett. And then the big three kind of changes we're going to talk about in the next couple chapters, so the biological, the cognitive, and social, so we'll get to those. And then, what else do I want to say? And then I go through in this chapter different theories that help explain adolescence, and I have to at least mention for sure G. Stanley Hall. So he is really like the father of adolescent development, because if you think about it, before, you'll hear me talk a little bit about the onset of the Industrial Revolution, really marking this time period in which adolescents and teenagers were no longer just working on the family farm or staying home with a family business. A lot of the fathers, at least at that time, because a lot of mothers were still just working at home or staying in the home, fathers went off to work, and they're kind of like, well, we have nothing for these teenagers to do. We need to kind of extend formal schooling, and now they're more in these peer groups that are together, and they're becoming this kind of unique. They're not just children; they're these teenagers, these adolescents, this youth, and so that's when we started talking about this. And so G. Stanley Hall really kind of coined the term adolescence in some ways, and really said this is a period of time worthy of study and understanding. So although I love G. Stanley Hall. G stands for, by the way, Granville. But what he thought about adolescence was he coined the term an inevitable time. And again, inevitable is kind of a strong word. Inevitable time of storm and stress. And so in some ways, I have a little bit of a problem with that. I'm much more of an optimist and see it as a kind of a time, much more of a time of possibility and excitement. I certainly think it can and often is a little bit confusing, tumultuous, things like that, but I certainly don't think it's inevitable. And the bigger piece that I disagree with Hall is that he saw it as predominantly, almost solely due to biological factors. So testosterone, these, menstruation making teenagers more moody, and testosterone making them more aggressive, and kind of similar to kind of how Freud thought about teenagers, about these aggressive sexual impulses and things like that led to inevitable challenges. But I think the reality is there's lots of other factors that contribute to why adolescence is challenging, and it's not all related to the adolescents' problems and their own problems inherent to them. There's a lot of societal issues, parental challenges, other factors like lack of sleep, things like that, too many pressures, too many things going on that can contribute to why it's a challenging time. So I think that we need to think of adolescence in a little bit more of a positive light. And then another quote from Anna Freud, who is in fact Freud's daughter. She spent her time studying adolescence, and one of her quotes is, "To be normal during the period of during the adolescent period is by itself abnormal." And again, kind of a negative, not even kind of, a very negative view of adolescence. So I go through these different theories. So we'll talk, or you'll see in the notes, the Freudian theory, Ericksonian theory, intergenerational conflict, different theories, even Piagetian theory. Those kind of they start as more biological, more hormonal in nature, like Freud, G. Stanley Hall, and then they get progressively more like social and environmental. So even Erickson would say it's a little bit more, it's not all about like psychosexual drives and aggression, it's a little bit more about how the adolescent interacts with other people and figures out who they are socially. And then Piaget would say, look, yes, you need this, you have some biological bases for your cognitive development, but you need a ton of input from the environment and stimulation from parents, teachers, schooling in order to develop cognitively, right? So that kind of shifts more. Learning is much more environmental, so we learn by reinforcers and consequences in our environment, or by, as Bandura would say, by kind of even observational learning, by just watching and seeing and kind of integrating that into our, consciousness. And then a couple things worthy of mentioning. So one thing that I think is important when I think about adolescents is the idea that they're pretty marginalized. So that's a theory, adolescent marginality. So I'm saying this in my dad's house, but he's not here, so he won't yell at me. But I remember as a teenager myself, one of the challenges I always had was I was a bright kid. I had my own ideas. I was a good kid. I was autonomous. I had lots of ideas and plans and things I wanted to do. But at the end of the day, if they didn't want me to do them, you'd be like, well, because I said so. A little bit of that, or because, you're under my roof, you got to do what I say. And there was a lot about, again, being kind of marginalized. I have all this autonomy, independence, cognitive skill, and yet at the end of the day, because they have more power than I do, the money, the means to attain things, the complete independence, adolescents can be stifled a little bit. And so sometimes that comes into play with behavioral issues or feeling oppositional or even legal consequences of things. So that's kind of an issue. So sometimes that's the root of arguments, and it's not a good developmental fit when teens, again, have a lot of desire to be independent, but there's a lot of people telling them what to do and things like that. And then there's also the idea that I alluded to earlier of intergenerational conflict. So, we come from inherently different generations, and even you, as probably 20, 21-year-olds, are kind of like, wow, kids these days, my sister or brother, they're so different than I am. We kind of want to say, like, our generation was better than the one before, or how you do things is ridiculous. Like, oh, we used to play outside, and now these kids, all they do is sit on their, technology. And so, again, when you kind of even increase that gap between, an 80-year-old grandparent or great-grandparent and a 13-year-old, there's a lot more conflict and a lot more misunderstandings, and, that can cause some challenges in fighting. And so, like I was also saying, it's not all about the adolescent being this hormonally crazed person. There's also some things that the other individuals in their lives bring to the equation that make adolescence a little bit more challenging, right? So that's what I want to say. And then finally, just the point that I think when you hear the term adolescent, and people even hear like, oh my gosh, you want to work with adolescents? You want to be a middle school teacher? What is wrong with you? Like, why would you want to work with them? Or, I have, as I have 2 kids. And especially with my daughter, I hear this more like, just wait till she's a teenager. She's 6 now. But I think my daughter hears that stuff too. And so sometimes it plants a little seed in their head or my head. Luckily, I know this stuff and I will combat it. But, it's not like she's going to turn and grow like 3 heads and turn, whatever, into some kind of crazy monster. But I think sometimes setting up the expectation that it's going to be bad based on the media, based on what other people say, I think reframing it to say, yeah, there's some things that are hard, but it doesn't last forever, or there's things I can do to make this a better transition. I think that is certainly a much healthier way to approach the adolescent period. And so I hope through this class, that you figure that out, and that can be a benefit.